Welcome again, Keith. It's great to have you. Today, everybody, we're going to be talking about Keith's new novel, hot off the press, really. I think it's just been released, called Contemplating Oblivion. And look, this is a really brilliant hard science fiction exploration into all sorts of mind design possibilities and different body morphologies and really fascinating plot devices. Some of these plot devices are quite reminiscent, at least to me, of Greg Egan, who's a famous hard science fiction Australian author. A bit of Stross Doctorow's Rapture of the Nerds, post-singularity stuff, and The Kiln People by David Brin. But Wiley's had 30 plus years of interest and research, and that really puts Keith into like a really good position to write about this sort of stuff. So it's really mind-expanding material here, far future science fiction that's based on the best of what we understand of how physics works today, and some speculation as to, well, it reminds me a bit of speculative physics. So yeah, fantastic. It's great to have you again. This sort of stuff really interests me. I got some really good qualia reading it. So yes, thank you so much for spending the time to do it.
Thank you for having me, Adam. Always a pleasure to chat with you.
Cheers. Yeah. So I guess a good place to start is a high-level overview. So can you give me a quick high-level view, 100,000-foot view of the story before we discuss your reasons for writing it?
Sure. So, first of all, here's the cover. I like what I came up with there. Um, Title is Contemplating Oblivion, and it basically pulls together a bunch of ideas that I wanted to present in one fictional narrative that I hope sort of goes well together. Um, I do have a long-standing interest in the topic of mind uploading, and I wanted to tell a story not necessarily about mind uploading, but actually to depict a world in which it is a fully mature technology and just sort of show what that world might be like. Um, I also wanted to get at some sort of really fun philosophical ideas, such as consciousness. What is it, and why does it have the properties that it does, and why does it seem so inexplicable? And then, of a very different variety, I get into some cosmological ideas. The big one, the main thread of the story, being the seeming inevitability of the end of the universe. We have multiple models by which the universe might end there, and we're not entirely sure yet which one is correct. So there's the closed model, in which there is enough gravity and not enough mass to overcome the universe's expansion, and it eventually slows down and implodes. And then there are the flat and the open models, which are conceptually the same. Sort of mathematically, they're a little different, but really they have the same end, which is that the universe continues to expand and just kind of fizzles out. So I put a flag in the sand on the unsure nature of that theory right now. I basically said, in the story, it is determined that the correct cosmological model is an open model. So everyone's worried about about the universe just kind of fizzling and fading out, sort of a few trillion years or whatever later. So yeah, sort of what does that mean, sort of in terms of purpose and meaning of life, and especially in the far future when people attain something akin to immortality. And therefore, the angst of sort of an impending demise is far more angstful than it is for us now. See, what are the other major topics? I think that's that. So those all come together. We can sort of go through the, sort of the book jacket description that kind of ties the whole thing together into a single storyline. But that's sort of how it all came together.
That's where your ideas came from. I mean, you've been associated with the transhumanist and posthumanist scene for quite a while, supplying articles to H plus IEET and a bunch of other organisations, I imagine. So you've been pretty prolific in your output over the many years. But what was it in yourself that really motivated you to get interested in these ideas and then subsequently write a novel like this?
It's been a long journey. Nothing like this novel occurred to me 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago. But yeah, in 1993, give or take, sort of right when I began college, I discovered the MERG, the Mind Uploading Research Group, which was run by some colleagues that I still know now 30 years later, such as Randall Kona and Joe Strout. Um, and I maintained those connections and have sort of continued to pursue the ideas for a long time. It all kind of came to a head in 2014 when I wrote my book, A Taxonomy and Metaphysics of Mind Uploading. That was a nonfiction book, somewhere sort of straddling sort of futurism and just sort of philosophy of mind, kind of sort of sat in both spaces at once. And ever since then, so for the last 10 years, I've just been kind of dropping articles. I haven't written anything else resembling a book since then, but I keep writing articles. Randall Kona and I wrote an article that got published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. All the other articles have been sort of a self-published or op-ed style. IEET has published a number of them for me. I think one or two appeared in H+. Trying to remember where else they might have appeared other than sort of on my website. And then they often get posted on the Carbon Copies Foundation website, and also the Brain Preservation Foundation website, both organizations that I'm connected with or affiliated with. At any rate, so it would have been about last summer, because I started the book in September. So sometime last summer, I just sort of got the idea. And I was looking at you asked me sort of where this came from for our notes. And I went all the way back to the beginning and could not figure it out. Where my notes begin, most of the ideas for the book seem to have been full-fledged. So I don't remember how it came into being. So the premise of the book is that it is this is a book about like the real future. We're not talking a book about 2100 or 2400. This book is set 1,000,000 years in the future. In the interests of hard science fiction, I don't have faster than light travel or faster than light communication, not even anything like an Ansible, no sort of cheating device of any sort. So humanity has spread across the galaxy, but only because I set it 1,000,000 years in the future, and they've had time to get pretty far. So because it's set so far down the road, I can basically open the box on technology. So in this world, mind uploading is, well, let me step back from mind uploading. Physics, I refer to physics as being solved. We have completely solved essentially every question of, sort of scientific physical reality. We've sort of reconciled gravity and quantum mechanics and subatomic interactions and fields and forces. Of course, I have to play a little fast and loose with this because as I'm writing the book in the 21st century, we don't have a lot of those answers. So I'm just sort of, sort of imagining this future where all of that is just, we're just done with it. And what does that world look like? So there are only two major points of curiosity in the world that the story is set in. One concerns the philosophy of mind and consciousness, and the other is a cosmological issue, and they're not directly related until later in the story, which is the main sort of premise. So the thing about consciousness that remains unsolved even in 1,000,000 years is this seemingly unbridgeable divide between the physical and the metaphysical. So I take the model that the mind and consciousness emerge from the processing of information and the propagation of signals and information between connected nodes in a brain. There are other sort of theories of consciousness floating around, but that's the one that I sort of buy into. But in the story, even though that is the model by which consciousness arises, it still remains a complete mystery why a network configuration of this sort of network topology inspires a qualitative experience known as qualia like this. Why does this network configuration firing patterns feel red? And this firing of neural patterns feels like pain. Why? Well, a million years in the future, they still haven't solved it. So that's like a major sort of point of the book. And as a result, one of the major pastimes that these million future people engage in is exploring the space of all possible qualitative experiences. I have these
Qualia diving.
I have these characters called quail divers. Quail is the singular of qualia.
Yes.
The protagonist, the main character, is a quail diver, and her main pastime is tinkering with network configurations, which are basically computerized, and attaching them to her fully uploaded and computerized brain, because everybody's completely computerized in this million-year future. They mind uploaded a million years in the past, which is to say approximately our time. So they have completely computerized brains, and they can play with computerized networks and literally attach them to their brains and then see what they feel like. And this is like one of the major ways in which people pass their time in the book. So that's one of the main sort of pillars of the story, is this unsolved mystery of consciousness and this sort of major pastime of sort of trying different networks to see what they feel like. So the other pillar is this cosmological issue, which is that although they have solved the physics of the universe, including solving definitively which cosmological model is correct, and in the book I choose the open model, so the universe is going to fizzle out. They know that, but they haven't solved sort of the angst of that. So there's this pervasive fear that now that everyone's quasi-immortal, and civilization itself has now accumulated, a million years of culture and art and production, everyone's just sort of torn up about the fact that all of this is going to go away. Their individual lives will eventually end, but also just sort of on a grander scale, there's sort of the loss of human, sort of legacy. Like everything's just going to go away when the universe dies, and this is a huge source of angst for them. And this is sort of the world in which the story exists. Okay, so then what happens is the main character, Lysandra, this quail diver, she chances upon a neural configuration which, when she attaches to her brain and feels the quail of that experience, it gives her this sort of incomplete but sort of a hint of an idea that there is a solution to the end of universe survival problem, which I colloquially call the USP. It's pronounced USP, end of EOUSP. Everyone just calls it the USP in the book. It's a vernacular that all the characters are familiar with. So all of a sudden she has this idea that there's this solution to surviving the end of the universe, but the solution itself is a quail. Now, one of the defining features of qualia is you can't describe them. This is a famous thought experiment called Mary's Room, which basically, we can go into the details of Mary's Room, but the point is, you can't tell someone who's never seen red before a sufficiently lengthy, wordy description that then conveys to them, oh, that's red. The whole point is, it's impossible to do that. The only way to know what a quail feels like is to actually experience that quail. So here she is. She has discovered this neural configuration, a set of neurons connected together. And if she gloms them onto her brain and feels them, feels the conscious state that they inspire, she gets this notion of a way to survive the end of the universe. But she can't communicate it to anyone. She can't tell anyone what the solution is. The only way for anyone to understand what she has discovered is for them to wear, we call it wearing, wearing a neural configuration is a term in the book. Other people have to wear the configuration that she has discovered in order for them to also have this realization. So earlier in the book, the quail is incomplete. She only gets like a notion that there's sort of a solution out there, but she doesn't really know what it is. And that sets the quest on its path. The rest of the book is her trying to refine the quail to the point where she and the rest of humanity can achieve, the true solution. They'll actually know veritably how to survive. And it's sort of tantamount to sort of Eastern notions of enlightenment and nirvana to actually get to that point where you really get the full solution. But she's chasing it the whole book, the whole story. So I can't remember how the question started, but that's kind of that's the layout of sort of where the book gets sort of launches from.
Yeah, the Mary's room thought experiment is really interesting, and it really it explores the idea that you can know a lot. You can have book smarts about like how the brain works or how somebody experiences color. And Mary lives in a grayscale room. She's never seen any color at all except for black and white and gradients in between. But she is and like does all the academic research and becomes an absolute expert, a neuroscience expert on this sort of stuff, and knows everything there is to know theoretically about what it's like to experience color, except she's never actually experienced it. And then a doorway opens, and she walks out of the door into the real world, and then sees color for the first time. And the question is, does she learn anything new? Or does she learn anything new from the experience?
And
And
the way
well,
it's
maybe not
framed,
academically, but
right?
she experiences something new, which is sort of what you're saying here is a different thing than just knowing about. It's feeling.
Yeah, yeah. Mary's room is always presented as when she walks out of the room and sees a red rose, does she learn something? But we don't mean that, like you said, in the sort of
Hmm.
pedagogical sense. What we mean is, does she's supposed to have this complete understanding of redness, and yet when she sees a red rose for the first time, to say she learns something is to say she sort of learns this sort of new experience that should have been complete. And sort of the philosophy of mind implication is, well, if she does learn something new from that, that says something about sort of the relationship between sort of conceptual information and descriptions of things and qualia. It suggests that there's some sort of unbridgeable divide there. I think it's because it's a thought experiment. It's sort of open to interpretation. I think in my previous book, I actually explained away the experiment. I said that most people don't take the experiment seriously enough. If you really imagine that she truly knew um, the neuroscience, not just like a good old professional neuroscientist, but if she understood everything sort of in a level of completion that we can't quite imagine, maybe she would essentially build into her own neural network these networks that are tantamount to memories of having seen red, even though she never did.
Hmm.
And therefore, when she sees a red rose for the first time, it actually wouldn't be a new experience for her. I don't know, but that's sort of the question I came up with 10 years ago for my other book. And yet, I went the other direction with the novel. With the
Hmm.
novel, I said, they've completely solved physicality. They totally understand everything about how the brain works to the point that they've completely uploaded it. And yet, in the novel, they don't have that solution. They actually don't understand why qualia emerge from particular neural configurations. So, yeah, I've sort of gone both directions on that issue at different points in time.
Hmm. Hmm. It's really fascinating that it's not just humans. Like it's a bit difficult to know which characters had like a descendant from actual human minds and which ones are descendant from AI minds. There is this, like a bit of a debate in the transhumanist community at the moment as to whether AIs will ever become sentient or conscious, will ever be able to feel anything. Arguably now they don't. But at some point, it won't matter as long as they all converge on the right connectome patterns to be able to experience, right?
Precisely. So again, in my story set a million years in the future, making a brain is as easy as, I don't know, baking cookies. They can just spin off brains. Like they can glom the atoms together and the molecules together. They can make a brain anytime they want. And just to be clear, when I say brain, I'm not referring to a biological brain. Everyone's completely computerized. Their brains in the story are referred to as their brain orbs, which I kind of imagine as this tennis ball sized, sort of dense metallic object, which is, I imagine it is essentially being a neuromorphic, hardware structure of a neural network. But since they completely understand sort of the underlying theory of these things, they can just make one. So in the story, most of the characters are long ago uploaded humans, by which means I mean they were uploaded a million years ago, and now they're a million years old. But there are characters who are what we would call artificial intelligence. But I don't call them artificial intelligence because what's
Hmm.
artificial about them at that point? It's a million years after all this was invented. the brains that you make for them sort of out of whole cloth are exactly the same kinds of brains that the uploaded humans have. So there's nothing artificial about them anymore. So that term was completely antiquated, and I couldn't use it. And it's a sort of an insulting term. It sort of diminishes the value of something to call it artificial. So I washed that away, and I said, in a million years, well, what they call these things is just de novos. A
Yeah.
de novo is a person who is, their brain isn't really any different in its structural or functional sort of aspects from the uploaded humans. It's just a brain that happens to have been spun off, just sort of built instead of being the, sort of the consequence of an uploaded human a million years ago and then going through another million years of sort of experience as an uploaded thing. But even though I have de novo characters, and they do have some very subtle differences in the story just so that they're interesting enough to even be worth mentioning, they actually have very little about them that sort of distinguishes them from the humans. They're basically the same.
It's fascinating, yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of other minds, like the alien minds of, organisms with wildly different bodies and sort of ways of being in different environments. But pretty much, except for maybe a hive that comes along late in the book, yeah, they're all they're not conscious. They don't have,
Right.
well, they're not intelligent the way that we are, except for maybe one.
So another major theme of the story, which I constantly forget about this because it's just sort of my worldview. I forget that it's there. But in 2011, one of the articles I wrote, which I submitted to, oh my God, I'm forgetting. What's the major astronomy journal? I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of it now.
Oh, is the Fermi Paradox one?
Yeah, yeah. So, one
Which
thing
I
that
interviewed you about.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
if anybody's interested in that, we did an interview on that subject many moons ago, so it's
Yeah.
up there. You can find it.
Um, so this is something that a number of other people have written about. Gregory Paul and Earl Cox wrote a book that sort of made this point to me for the very first time. I was sort of introduced to it back in 1999. Ray Kurzweil has written the same conclusion in his book, and that conclusion is that I know this is not popular and people don't like to hear it and people definitely don't like to believe it, but I think it's very unlikely that there are sort of sentient tool building technological species in our galaxy. I leave the reason why leaves plenty of room for them to exist elsewhere in the universe. The reason, sort of the temporal aspect of that argument doesn't apply to other galaxies because they're far enough away that they may not have gotten here yet. But within our galaxy, in my opinion, if you do a sort of an honest, objective analysis of this issue and you don't sort of try to find a way for them to exist, it's very hard to rationalize that in the age of the galaxy, there could be another technological species that hasn't already gotten here yet. People are going to dislike it when they see me say this in the interview. They're going to say, this is a common argument, it comes up all the time. Read my previous article. Like I go through it and I defend my position pretty thoroughly. At any rate, so of course I set my own story in that worldview. So there's biology all over the galaxy. There are planets, covered in really beautiful life forms that the humans, as they spread across the galaxy, one thing that they sort of enjoy filling their time with is kind of, I call it solving a planet. Is basically sort of completely scientifically comprehending every aspect of the ecology and the biology of a planet. So fully understanding how the genetics works. Of course, it may not molecularly be similar to ours, fully understanding how the brains of the organisms work, just kind of completely solving it, which of course in a million years they have the wherewithal to do that. And they do find things that are animal-like. They have brain-like things, these sort of organs that, pass signals around in very similar ways. They just don't find anything that communicates with language in the way that humans do, or that builds, the kinds of fancy machines that we do. And there is one particular alien species, this sort of animal-like species, it's insentient, as we call it, that does play a role, which is that a researcher on this planet, the planet of Seleunis, discovers this sort of goopy, squishy little alien thing. It's kind of like a jellyfish and an octopus, and I don't know.
It's
the
a
whole
new
point.
alien.
It's radially symmetrical, and it's just kind of like a weird thing. It doesn't even have eyes, But It does have brain-like structures. It has these ganglia of sort of interconnected signal processing units. And of course, what are uploaded humans going to do who are quail divers anyway? Of course, they're going to take every alien network they find in the galaxy and attach it to their human brain and see what it feels like, right? That's just like, of course they're going to do that. And they do this all the time. And usually it doesn't amount to much. But this character, Minerva, um, Minerva is this sort of bio researcher who sort of, one of her major pastimes is solving planets. So she's on Seleucus and she discovers this animal and she attaches its brain to her brain in uploaded form. The whole thing, she takes the brain, she scans and uploads one of these organisms. The whole thing becomes, digital data at that point. She attaches the model to her computerized brain and she feels what sort of conscious experience she gets. And much like Lysandra, sort of falling across this neural configuration that gave her a sense of a solution to the USIP, Minerva has a sort of a similar experience. It doesn't really make her feel that there's a solution to the USIP, but it does make her feel this sort of very sort of warm, sort of inspiring sense of hope of surviving the end of the universe, even though it doesn't really speak to a solution necessarily. But even just that feeling of a hope in this particular world that the story is set in is incredibly valuable because all of humanity spread all over the galaxy, consisting of all these million-year-old people, and there's quadrillions of them, they are all in this state of angst. They are all sort of suffering in their worry about what's going to happen at the end of the universe. So Minerva has basically discovered essentially a drug. She's discovered this palliative drug that people can attach to their brains that will just sort of give them a sense of hope and make them feel better about the whole thing. And that all sort of, it all comes together in the story. It all kind of comes together. So yeah, that's sort of how that fits in.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Having some sort of existential hope is probably something that we're lacking, or I'm lacking a little bit at this stage in history. A lot of things to worry about, but maybe I ought to try and search for an alien life form I can borrow their Qualia. Yeah. So yes, I mean it's not really a dystopic novel, is it? I mean it's got its share of catastrophes, but the overall arc doesn't seem unhopeful, or it's not. It's. Would you classify it as a like a utopia? Not really.
The opposite of a dystopia would be a utopia. Utopias make for very boring stories. The reason stories, I mean, stories need conflict because conflict gives you tension and suspense. And not only is that what a writer wants in order to keep the audience strung along, it's what audiences want. A story in which everything just goes hunky dory is just not an interesting story. So I had to put various forms of stress and tension and conflict and resistance into the story to make it an interesting story. But the worldview is not a dystopian view. One of the most popular tropes these days is the killer AI robot. James Cameron and his Terminators have been trying to teach us some sort of lesson about hubris for what now, 40, 50 years, when they make it in the 80s. And most people just jump on that train. Like we just love thinking about how scary and what a big mistake making AI is. And I'm sick of it. Like I don't understand why everything has to be dystopian. I don't understand why everything has to be apocalyptic. I don't understand why everything has to just sort of be lamenting that all we do is just sort of wreck everything and we're gonna kill ourselves with AI because we're too dumb to not do it. If people like stories like that, it's covered. You'll find it out there. If that's the story you're looking for, there's plenty you won't have any trouble finding those stories. But I didn't tell that story, so my world, I wouldn't call it utopian. But it is a world in which technology is not the primary evil and enemy against which the protagonist must be rallying. It is a world in which, technology has successfully sort of solved a lot of problems. and then I sort of leave it alone at that point. I don't really make a big issue out of showing that it's all utopian. I just kind of say, what will the world be like in a million years if we basically use technology to make our lives better? So what are the sources of conflict then that make the story sort of scoot along? The main one, the main, sort of resistance that the protagonist, Lysandra, has to work against is that although she has only just discovered this neural network that gives her a sense of a hope for the USIP solution, sort of in the time of the book, nevertheless, for millennia leading up to this point in the story, the USIP itself, USIP, the end of universe survival problem, the USIP has been this pervasive source of angst. Everyone's been sort of vexing over it for thousands of years. And therefore, they've formed all sorts of theories about it. And one theory that's floating around is that although it is sort of frustrating to worry about the universe dying and everyone dying with it, we better not find a solution to it for the following sort of interesting reason, which is that if you sort of assume that there's this kind of triad relationship between matter and energy, and then the third one being information, or matter and entropy and information in these sort of interplay. So imagine then if we found a way to hold a person's mind, or their brain to some extent, because the mind requires some sort of physical sort of representation. If you could find a way to hold that off to the side while the universe goes through its kind of cycle to cycle sort of, begetting of the next universe, right? If you hold off some people so that they can survive that, then does that imply that you've sort of bled a little bit of energy off of the overall universe to universe to universe system? Will the next subsequent universe be just a tiny little bit smaller as a result of having pulled some people aside so they can survive into the next universe? And as a result of the universe, of the sequence of universes getting slightly smaller from one to the next, does that imply that the whole system might slowly run down, and sometime in the far future, a gazillion universes later, will the sequence itself fade out, and then you will have a real oblivion? Now it's not just the end of the universe, it's the end of this otherwise infinite cycle of universes. So I just kind of spun the whole thing out of whole cloth. I just came up with this idea when I was coming up with the book, a year ago. I don't know. I kind of came up with the whole thing. And that is what the main antagonist, Demos, is fighting against. He says, we can't try to solve the USIP. We can't try to survive the end of the universe, because if we do find a way to do it, we might kill everything. And like more than just the universe, we might kill the universes, the metaverse. And so Demos thinks that this is absolutely the most insufferable and intolerable thing. And of course, he's fighting against Lysandra very hard throughout the book. So that is one of the primary thrusts of conflict throughout the story.
It's cool that you've got like the so-called bad guy in the novel isn't like, just a genuinely bad person. He's just ideologically driven.
If
so
he's
many
right,
people
he's the good guy.
Yeah, that's right.
He has this theory, and the only reason that some of the characters, or many of the characters, or any of the characters don't take him seriously is just that they don't think he has the right cosmological model for what happens over a sequence of multiple universes. But, if he actually was right, then, he's actually the hero of the story. So I just leave that as sort of I wouldn't say I leave it as an unknown. Things are resolved at the end in a way that I won't get into. But, sort of if one wanted to imagine a different way of telling the same story, you could tell the version where he was actually right all along. I don't know.
Have you read The Free Body Problem?
I haven't read it.
The trilogy.
I saw the first season of the show. Isn't it Chinese?
There's only one. Yes. It's Citron Liu, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Yes, it's amazing. And there are some similar plot elements there, which I won't really go into. But yeah, it seems so like you've converged on some similar ideas about like, how to survive the end of the universe and all that sort of thing, or what happens if you do, and some of the shortfalls there. So definitely it's interesting that like different minds can come at the similar ideas from different angles without real knowledge of each other. So it is fascinating. Now, Nick Bostrom's written a book recently, Deep Utopia, which I think covers a lot of these ideas. So, if anybody's interested in why they shouldn't worry about being too bored in the long-term future should we survive, then that's a really good book to read as well. But yeah, it's just recently came out, so
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I haven't seen it yet.
yes, yeah. Now you explore identity a lot in this book, and you've done a lot of research into what it might be like to sort of do branching and all this. But let's talk about some, I guess, kinds of minds, like an individualistic mind and hive minds and things like that, and multiple cells in the same brain. There's this idea of a spectrum between like this oneness, this individualness, and this open individualness. So, I mean, I spoke to you about this before. I just was wondering where you sit in terms of this, whether you think that there's a Goldilocks zone of oneness, and whether you're more aligned closely with the closed individualism model, the empty individualistic model, or the open individualism model.
The models that sort of bring everyone together in a sort of abstract but shared sort of either sense of identity, if not literally sense of experience, are they're appealing because they're beautiful. Does that make them true? At the far extreme, you have these models where identity is reduced down to such short segments of time that it basically, doesn't last more than the duration of a conscious moment, some fraction of a second. And then, your identity at the end of a sentence isn't the same identity at the beginning of a sentence. You're just some other person, and we're just sort of in a perpetual state of dying and rebirth or something. So those are sort of the two extremes, right? At one end, identity is so fleeting that it's essentially erased. And at the other end, it's so all-encompassing that not only do you have an identity that's sort of pervasive, but actually it kind of blends with everybody else. So, if there is an actual truth in any of all of this, then surely it's got to be somewhere in the middle. But I'm not. I would definitely not commit to a position on that spectrum. So yeah, the issue that I do illustrate in the book is this topic that sort of been pursuing for 30 years, which we haven't spoken about yet in this interview, is that not just mind uploading in general, but actually the branching interpretation, the psychological branching model of identity, and what that means in the sort of in an uploading sort of sense. So, unlike a number of people, as far as I can tell, based on sort of my online debates and arguments, and also just sort of what other people, sort of other sort of well-renowned people write, I seem to be more committed to the psychological branching model than a lot of other people. So again, it's my story, it's my world, I get to build it my way. So I imagine, and again, remember, this is not set 100 years in the future. I'm not telling the story of how humans developed uploading technology and how they went through the initial decades of sort of, wrangling with the difficulties of it. Like, that's all completely washed away because it's a million years in the future. So in this world, people have these computerized brains, which is to say that they can treat them as easily as we treat computer data files. And there are a number of things that they can do with their brains. So if you imagine taking the momentary state of a brain, so what is the current configuration of the neurons and the synapses primarily? That's sort of the connectome model. And if you want to sprinkle in any other neurological features, just add them. Whatever it is that we need in order to consider a completed model of how the brain actually physically and functionally works. Imagine then that at any given moment in time, you capture in stasis basically that momentary state. So you can start it and stop it and start it and stop it. Greg Egan explores this in Permutation City for sure. And this comes up in mind uploading sort of speculation. I talk about it in the previous book, The Taxonomy. What does it sort of mean to be able to take a brain, put it into a state of stasis, meaning it's not it's not functionally operationalizing sort of signal processing any longer. What does it mean to stop it and then start it 10 years later? So another thing you can do other than start it and stop it is you can take this thing, which is just a data file. So in the story, I called such a sort of a moment, a momentary description. I call it an etching. So people make etchings of their brains, which is to say that they're basically making, my echo's talking to me. They make sort of a recording of their brain state at a given moment in time. And the main reason that the characters do this, they do it for two reasons. One is the sort of the good old-fashioned backup argument that if they do die in some calamity, they can be revived. And there's sort of this ongoing debate about whether a revived backup, what does that mean in relation to your identity? So, is it actually any comfort to know that you have a backup? Does that make you any less fearful of death? And people have different takes on that. I actually, personally, I don't take a whole lot of comfort in it. I am one of these people who thinks that, my moment-to-moment sort of conscious experience is very sort of, real. And the fact that there's sort of, a recording of my brain from 5 minutes ago doesn't give me a lot of solace about my consciousness, but it would give me solace about sort of the, perpetuation of sort of what I've achieved in sort of building who I am, because that would continue on in what is called a different branch. So one reason that the characters in the story make occasional etchings is for that purpose. The other main reason is to transmit them around. So once you've sort of taken your stationary brain state and etching, you can now use that as a form of transportation. Nothing I'm saying is like people talk about this all the time. I'm not saying anything particularly new. So you could transmit it through the physical computer network of a planet to another point on the planet, just sort of transmit it through the internet effectively. And you can then sort of recreate a new brain orb that is configured with that etching in a different physical location. And you have essentially traveled to that new location transporter style. This is, I don't know, I think this is probably pretty well understood at this point. You can also transmit it not through a wired network, but of course wirelessly over sort of the million-year futured version of radio transmissions or laser transmissions. I don't care, something like that. And this is the primary means of transportation in the story. So the characters transmit around planets in this fashion all the time. They transmit within a solar system in sort of the wireless beamed fashion. And this is almost the exclusive mode of interstellar travel. So to get to other stars, they make an etching and they send it off. And remember, I don't have faster than light concepts. So it takes them the travel time of light to get anywhere. So a star that is 50,000 light years away, you set yourself on a 50,000 year trip. But they're a million years old, so they're actually okay with it. And of course, they don't have any conscious experience during that time because that's just a stationary, it's just a record. So it's actually kind of funny. I depict in multiple points in the story the conscious experience of sort of having your consciousness fade out, and then you instantly wake up on a new planet, surrounding a new star, and no time whatsoever has transpired. What does that feel like? I depict that multiple times. So then, the other question that comes up in philosophy of mind debates all the time is, well, what happens if you have multiple sort of instantiated brains operationalizing separate minds that came from some common origin? So this is what is called branching identity, where you have concurrent branches that have a shared sort of ancestral mind, shared ancestral identity, shared ancestral set of memories. So that all features in the book a lot. In contemporary philosophy of mind debates, there's this whole raging debate about whether either of them is more original and the other is just some sort of copy of kind of, sort of diminished identity status, and it's not really as real or as original. Of course, I don't really buy into any of that. I believe that psychological branching identity is the model of your identity. It doesn't make any difference which atoms you're built of. It doesn't make any difference whether your stream of consciousness has, come to a cessation and then restarted. All the articles I've been writing for the last 10 years have been attempting to undermine these sort of what I see as erroneous theories. So in this million-year future, the characters do this quite comfortably. They send themselves around. They create branches of themselves to travel all the time. Interstellar travel pretty much requires it because the only way to do sort of a a verified data transmission is to send the data there and then verify that the data has been received before the etching, at the origin is destroyed. So if you're going to go so far that it's not practical to do this sort of receiving of a receipt, if it takes you 50,000 years to send a data file to another star, are you going to wait another 50,000 years to get a receipt that says, okay, it was received, you can erase the etching? Like, that's just not practical. So people don't do that in the story. If they undergo interstellar travel, they generally immediately branch. They send off a new branch, but they just continue on, in their planet of origin. They just and a number of people watching this interview and reading the book will have the interpretation that the one that went to the new stars is just a copy. And the whole point of all the various articles I've been writing and my book from 10 years ago is that is the wrong interpretation. They're actually both sort of, equivalent. The way I phrase it in my 2014 book is that all mental descendants of a common mental ancestor have equal primacy in their claim to the original identity. And again, my defense of that is that psychological features are the only features that identify you. Therefore, being in a certain place or being built out of certain atoms or having an ongoing stream of consciousness, none of these things actually are salient to your identity, which I think I sort of prove in all my various writing. So if all you're left with is a memory basis of identity, then the implication is that all of the sort of instantiations of memories carrying forward are equivalent descendants. Anyway, I'm going on. But all of that is sort of in the book. And it's all just sort of taken for granted that this is the correct model. So in a million years, everyone's all the debates just done. In the vein of like fiction, in the vein of storytelling, I actually have a number of scenes in which the characters are sort of discussing these issues, but that's mostly one of these sort of I've lost the word. One of these ways of sort of showing something to a reader. So I'm illustrating the characters kind of like sorting through some of these interesting philosophical quandaries, but actually the characters themselves aren't particularly knotted up about it. It's just a way of sort of showing the reader how this world operates.
Yeah, I did notice there's not much existential angst around like having copies and all those sorts of things, and there's not worry about like so there's not much solipsism. Like I didn't notice any, at least as far as I interpret it. I didn't notice that there was much radical skepticism about other minds and things in the book. I think that these age-old philosophical debates have been, either they're not solved but nobody cares anymore, or they have been solved off stage somewhere. But do you think, just generally, solipsism is a feasible approach to a feasible worldview in a world of actual branching, hiving, and reunifying identities? Do you think that if we did manage to get to a stage where this was possible, do you think that sort of philosophical concern would go away?
Why would anything about branching identity lead one to conclude that oneself is the only conscious person and that everyone else is?
Well, no, I'm suggesting that it would be the other way. It would sort of reduce concern.
Yeah,
that one is the only person, because like you're branching and you're constantly being copied. I mean, you're reunified. I'm not a radical skeptic myself.
I see.
And I'd say that this kind of world might even reduce uncertainty there, and might increase certainty that we do live in a world with other minds.
Oh yeah, definitely. Right. I don't think there's a whole lot of real concern about solipsism these days. I don't think most people are seriously interested in whether everyone else in the world is a philosophical zombie. But where I thought you might be going with it is that in a world where branching is done on a regular basis and has been done for a million years of consistent history,
And
then
hiving, right?
we haven't got to that yet.
Right,
Then
yeah.
all of the contemporary concerns about identity will have been washed away. So
Mm.
yes, I agree with that. Yeah, we can talk about hiving next. Although let me on the brief moment of solipsism, I'll just point out that there's a funny scene in the book where a character sort of gets her brain scrambled temporarily and sort of inadvertently becomes deeply solipsistic and believes that sort of none of her friends are real, and it's not a particularly important scene, but it's kind of a funny scene.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just to flag that the idea is there. It's pretty cool. What about like do you believe is it useful to see humans as we are today, at least, as sort of legions, like several Dr. Jekylls and Mr. Hydes in our same brain? You know, a strong emotion can bring out one character, another emotion, another set of circumstances can bring out a different one. Is it useful to think of it like in the same way as we think of branching identities in your book, or do you think that
Well,
there's some enduring metaphysical ego that's the same for each of them,
I
each
hadn't
of the
thought about
ones
it that
inside
way.
our? Mm,
I hadn't thought about it that way, but there is one character in the book who branches with want and abandon. He just spins off copies of himself. Um, I actually didn't mean that phrase. I almost never use that word. It's coming up in the conversation. But he spins off sort of other branches of himself uh, way more comfortably than the other characters. And all of these various branches that are all kind of parallel tend to have very radical divergences in their personalities, to the point that some of them become, sort of direct enemies of one another. Uh, so I hadn't thought about it this way, but maybe what I did was illustrate teasing apart a person's elements of personality into multiple individuals who then sort of bring each little personality concept sort of into sort of one sort of alignment or something. Um, it's a fun take on it.
hmm. It is interesting if you could like branch and you'd have Dr. Jekyll Adams and Mr. Hyde Adams, and you could have a variety of a spectrum of different versions of Adam, and then sort of all keep them running in parallel, but as part of a sort of a hive. It would be fascinating, but kept them all
Well,
alive in a sense, right? And enduring. Yeah, it would be a like a really weird
well,
place to be.
so in the story, a lot of what the characters do is, like I said, sort of one of the major pastimes is this quail diving, just sort of exploring consciousness. Another thing they do is engage in just sort of explorations of relationships. Um, they're very interested in and curious about the ways in which they can interrelate to one another. Um, and one way they do this is, not an idea that I originated. This is a very common idea. Star Trek, of course, has made it famous. It's been shown in other, depictions as well. What the characters like to do in my story is to sort of temporarily play a game where they soften the borders between their minds. Oh, just to be clear, everybody sort of has what we would call telepathy. It's not telepathy in any sort of I personally don't believe in, and I certainly don't convey in my writing any kind of sixth sense and extrasensory gobbledygook.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
just that everybody has a computerized brain, so they all just have built-in Wi-Fi, effectively, right? So they're all
Yeah,
just able to communicate with each
naturalized
other,
telepathy.
right? Right. It's technological telepathy, whatever.
Hmm.
Um, so a game people will play is they will sort of go inward into some sort of almost meditative state, where then in this kind of deep inward state with a very sort of high bandwidth sort of connection to a bunch of other people kind of around them, say in a room, they kind of bring all their minds into some sort of shared sort of cognitive and conscious space. They can kind of um, they can kind of share each other's qualia, right? So if one of them some neural sort of component of their brain is inspiring a qualitative experience, well, a lot of that sort of signal propagation and data propagation, that's just sort of, it's just neural networks. It's all just physical. It's all just data transmission. There's nothing spiritual. There's nothing extrasensory. But that data processing can just sort of, over the Wi-Fi network, kind of make its way to the other people in the room playing the same game. So now they can all kind of feel things together. They're not just telepathically sending verbal messages. They can undergo an experience in which they feel something, and everyone else in the room is feeling it with them, sort of in a sympathetic sense. And this is something they do for fun. They're very interested in how deeply they can kind of bring their minds into a single entity. And, again, a very common trope in science fiction is to make sure that this is all completely evil, right? I mean, Star Trek is bald-faced that being in a hive is totally evil. And
but mind melding is okay.
Sorry?
Mind melding is okay as long as you're a Vulcan, right? My mind to your mind, your thoughts to my thoughts.
In line with everything I've been describing here, I only describe it in essentially positive and uplifting terms. But yeah, so hiving is a major thing. And then I want to sort of be delicate about how I introduce the next thing because it's a bit of a spoiler, but there is a character in the book which takes the concept of being a hive sort of to its logical sort of full extent. And that character does play some interesting roles in the plot. And other than that, I'm not going to say anything else about it. But
yeah,
it's an interesting character.
Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating to be able to explore these sorts of ideas now in the current century. But gee, I'd really love to live in this world where it was actually possible to do it rather than just explore the ideas.
Again, because I show it in a non-dystopian way, and it's just a way of sort of feeling passion and feeling love and also feeling lust, but just sort of feeling this connectedness and this, sort of, well, you were saying sort of oneness. I mean, I think it sounds great. I'd love to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not averse to being exploring hive minds. If I had that opportunity, I'd do it. Bring it on. Exactly. I mean, there is some I guess. I mean, we know that there's hives that do exist, but they don't have direct neuron to neuron connections in the natural world, except for mutations, right?
But in entomological theory, ants and bees, no, of course they're not doing that. But what biologists will sometimes describe is the concept of the superorganism. So
yes, that's correct.
What the colony itself is sometimes treated, by ethologists as being one more organism. So you've got 1,000 bees, but there's actually 1,001 entities because you've got 1,000 bees and the superorganism, and it's this other thing, which is the conglomerated mind. I don't know why I keep bringing up bees. I've always been far more into ants, frankly. At any rate, so yeah, they're certainly not engaging in the kind of sort of direct brain-to-brain communication that we're talking about, but yes, treating that sort of cohesive entity that comes into existence as a result of sort of coordinated communication, treating that as some sort of new emergent being features in the book. I do talk about when the characters enter into a hive and create a hive, some new being comes into being that only exists while they're in the hive, and it only exists because it is the conglomeration of all the other characters. This isn't a huge plot point, but I do talk about it and show it in the book. Yeah.
It could be interesting to etch that and then, invoke it.
Okay, well, that never crossed my mind. But
well, I mean, in the real world, we know that Siamese twins do exist, which are conjoined at the head. There's been studies on the Hogan sisters where they have some sort of thalamic bridge going on, such that there's some sort of sharing of experience going on there. So it's not like there's absolutely no precedence in the real world for these ideas. I just wanted to drop that so that it's acknowledged at least. So yeah, it's quite fascinating. I mean, the Hogan sisters are conjoined at the head. At least ostensibly, they seem to be able to appreciate each other's feels Like one can taste tomato sauce and love it, while the other one just doesn't like tomato sauce and will screw up their nose when the other's eating something with tomato sauce on it, apparently, right? So they might have some sort of sharing of like emotions, because I guess they're sharing some of the same hormones and chemicals that flow around their shared brains. Yeah, but
Yeah, I actually don't know too much about those medical cases, but yes, I understand your point. Yeah.
like, how do we reunify Hive experienced branches into a singular psychological continuity branch? What
Wait a
might it
minute.
feel like to exit a hive but have a memory of what it's like in a
Okay.
hive?
Right. So the reason that I'm momentarily confused is that I use the term reunification in a different sense in the story. So just to, uh, I do refer to reunification in the story, but it's when two branches come back together and sort of become a single person who then has the union of the memories of the two branches and plus the sort of ancestral singular memories leading up to the branch point. That's how the term reunification comes up in the story. So
Okay.
then, yes, the characters go into hives temporarily and then they come back out and they continue on their singular lives. And what does it mean to sort of carry away those memories? And I suppose ultimately I don't know, but actually what I show in the book a lot is that they don't do a very good job of that. I often show that when they're coming out of a hive, the memories of the experience often kind of fade away and they don't get to take the entire experience away with them. And if they want to feel it again, they've got to do it again. I do still say that like the characters who are more experienced at this and build up the skill of it are also able to build up the skill of retaining the memories with a little bit more clarity. Again, none of this is too salient to the story, but it's sort of yeah, it is interesting.
I'm not sure if there's any minimum requirements for etching reunification that we haven't already discussed. But what do you think the minimum requirements are for the persistence of identity by etching, the compression information loss?
How precise, how accurate, how complete does basically a brain scan have to
Mm.
be in order for its revival as sort of an ongoing person to be considered a preservation of identity? So, short answer, I don't know. Um, Surely there is some tolerance in there because we take knocks to the head and we get drunk and kill a bunch of neurons and we undergo various periods of amnesia. Um, there are all sorts of neurological traumas that have consequent psychological degradations, the result of which we do not label as an erasure of our identity. So it seems like there's a lot of room for sort of flexibility in there, but ultimately how to define those boundaries, you know, I suspect that that is one of the leading questions that sort of psychiatry and psychology and sort of many other people would have sort of a lot of very professional input on that, and I'm actually not sure I know.
There's parts of the book, I guess, there is a concern about whether an identity like different branches of Lysandra wants to reunify with the old branches.
Lysandra, as she sort of travels around the galaxy trying to find hints that will help her complete her quest, is sort of faces this problem that any character undergoing regular interstellar travel has to deal with, which is that, like I said, when they travel in an interstellar fashion, they generally branch, meaning that instead of leaving the etching at the origin point in stasis and then erasing it upon receipt of successful arrival in a remote location, instead the individual in the origin point just continues living, and the one who's traveling thousands of years later emerges in some remote star system and spends some time there, and then they might travel thousands of years back, and um, and now you've got two parallel branches that have to decide whether to reunify into a single person or just sort of continue on their merry way as two individuals forever. Um, so most of the characters, including it's sort of assumed that all the unnamed quadrillions of humans in society, most of them are just sort of perfectly comfortable with this. They just don't really they're not concerned with it. If they want to reunify, they do. If any of them don't, they're just happy to just sort of remain branched. Nobody cares. Lysandra, the main character, is conspicuously linear in her sort of relation to her own identity. She's more reticent to branch, and she's more reticent to reunify than the other characters. And one might ask, why would I make the protagonist of this story in this future world the most sort of old-fashioned? And the reason is that it gives us as contemporary 21st century readers sort of an eye into what this world might look like sort of from the outside. What would it be like to suddenly appear a million years in the future, sort of in this world, but with sort of our current sort of state of things, and just sort of try to make sense of it. So she gives us as the reader a way to sort of feel our own discomfort about these ideas, because she's basically walking through those discomforts every time she has to make a decision about flying off to some star and coming back and deciding what to do about it. So that's why she's sort of spectacularly old-fashioned.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting having an experience if you were to reunify and, the world from two different points of view at the same time. Your memory, like you could even be in the same room to 4 or 5 of your other branches, and you could remember the perspective of all 5 people in that room. It'd be very strange.
I don't directly show that. I do show that when 2 branches of a character reunify, they retain essentially sort of a union of, like, they just remember all the memories essentially. I don't specifically show that in most cases. There aren't too many scenes where a reunified character remembers being both branches, like having a conversation with each other. There is one exception. There is a scene where a side character is extremely skilled at branching and sort of playing interesting games between the branches in terms of sort of the conscious experiences that the different branches are having at the same time, sort of on a stage where everyone else is watching. It's essentially a performance artist who kind of plays with branching as his sort of method of performance. There is this character who kind of does this and takes the other characters sort of on this tour of really strange, localized, sort of branching overlaps. But for the most part, I don't actually show that coming up too much. It just, I didn't really have a need in the story for too many of the characters to interact with each other and reunify. There are branches that, even though they are common branches of a common ancestor, are interacting directly with one another. That happens. It's just the story didn't really lead to them reunifying later. It didn't come up too much.
Would it be too much of a spoiler to talk about the Ontoscendians?
So we can talk about them a little bit. So,
yeah, they're pretty interesting, man.
Yeah. So
mysterious.
I do have. They're sort of like they're like Atlantis. They're some ancient lost civilization of wise sages, and they seem to have essentially solved the Usopp in the very, very far distant past. They're not aliens, they're humans, but they within this million-year window, they did it a long time ago, and they all died out. And it's not really clear what happened, and it's not really clear sort of how to get any purchase off this, because they didn't really leave any hints. And I'm not going to go too much into sort of how that feeds into the story. It actually does come into the story. It feeds into the plot in a certain way. But yeah, they just sort of, they're the old mysterious lost civilization that's always fun to sort of read about in any kind of sort of story of this sort.
I think part of the story, I remember the concept of qualia, pure qualia, without the computation, without the agent there to experience it. Now, I guess it might be my interpretation of it, but do you think it's possible? Does physicalism, at least I think you're a physicalist in terms of your philosophy of how physics works and everything, and so do you think it's possible to have qualia without the process that generates it? Do you think you can just put qualia in a box?
Um, my I don't think any of us should be too committed to our models of how the mind works in the 21st century, and yet most of us are anyway. So the model that I have tended to go for is this model in which when signals propagate through a network of connected nodes, and I think recurrence is critical in some fashion that I haven't figured out, when the signals sort of loop around on themselves in these recurrent ways, that that dynamic process, it requires a dynamic change of state, moment by moment as a signal is propagating, gives rise to consciousness. That signal could then arise from one of two major sources, and this is a huge point of contention in philosophy of mind right now. One is a physical network of physical nodes that are spatially distributed in space. So that's what a brain is. It's a spatially distributed set of neurons that are propagating signals, amongst their physical selves. There's this question, well, what if you take the model of that and run it in a computer in a way? So first of all, we have this concept of a neuromorphic computer, which would sort of recreate the physical structure of the brain. But another theory is, well, what if you just run a model of a neural network in a computer, but not in such a fashion that each modeled neuron is some sort of physical neuron or even a physical artificial electronic neuron. It's just a representation of a neuron within a computer's sort of memory and storage. If you ran a model like that, does it give rise to consciousness, or is that inadequate? So some people are absolutely certain that just doesn't work. It produces, I guess I would say it's a philosophical zombie. I don't know what else they would call it. There is a scene in the book where I very briefly, I don't really linger on this too long, but there is a conversation between characters in which I illustrate why I personally feel that such a non-physically sort of analogous network can also be adequate to produce conscious experiences. Now, a lot of people watching this are just gonna say, well, he's wrong. That's fine. But in the book, I do sort of defend my line of reasoning. It's a short scene. It's not, some long 10-page technical non-fiction article. It's just a short scene in which characters are discussing the issue. But I kind of walk through why I feel that. So in answer to your question, even some sort of non-physically analogous network is still itself a physical computer undergoing physical state changes. The electrons are sort of traveling around through the wires, or the photons are traveling around through the fibers, whatever. There is a physical change moment to moment that you can't get away from. I don't see how you can have qualia or consciousness or just cognition, just thinking. I don't see how you can do that with no physicalness and no physical change. Some atoms have got to be like doing something, or else where does all the other stuff? Where's all the metaphysics come from? That's my take on it. People might feel differently.
What I'd like to cover is ethics and game theory. And there's a quote which I found pretty nice, and I think it relates to my interest in ethics and reducing suffering. But it seems as though they're at a stage where suffering is pretty optional. They don't need it as a motivational device. A particular quote from the book, Lysandra, while climbing a mountain, sort of highlights a replacement of pain with other kinder qualia. In the sense, she says she felt no quale of exhaustion where simple status messaging would suffice. She felt no pain, the worst quale ever discovered by natural selection and capriciously thrust upon naturally evolved organisms in utterly merciless fashion. All Lysandra needed was to make it to the top, and that was enough to keep her going. And the sight she would behold from the summit, the length and the duration of the quest, the rarity of the accomplishment, these would be her rewards, not the overcoming of superfluous sufferings as some facetious and misplaced sense of triumph. So yeah, what are your thoughts about their dialogue in posthumanist and transhumanist circles today around the need to phase out unneeded suffering?
Um, yeah, pain sucks. Um,
Yeah, generally.
and it's funny that we will almost rationalize it as a source of motivation. Um, what is, in to the quote you just sort of picked out, we take our value from running a marathon in overcoming the physical difficulty of it, and that physical difficulty basically is a form of pain. It's the fact that running a marathon is difficult. But what's difficult about it? Well, what's difficult about it is that it hurts. Um, Even if that, sometimes it might be a little unclear whether or not exhaustion is necessarily painful, but so she's hiking up a mountain. Is the fact that it's just sort of physically painful to do this. You get all sore, and your body's full of injuries, but you push through where a character of weaker constitution wouldn't have made it, and therefore your willingness to bear the pain all the way to the summit is what makes your reward worthy. And my point there is that in a million years they're done with that. They're not going to put up with rationalizing pain to make themselves feel good about their accomplishments anymore. They're just sick of it. Instead, they accomplish things because they like the end point. You don't climb a mountain because it's hard to climb a mountain. You climb a mountain because the view from the top of a mountain is spectacular. um, you know, so I guess that was my point. It was that she was trying to do it because the result of doing it was rewarding, not the result of overcoming the difficulty of doing it was rewarding. Yeah, and then another, as you said, another thing that sort of features here and there throughout the book is just that the qualia of pain. I don't pick it apart too much, but emotional pain, physical pain, whatever. There are sort of scenes of the characters just sort of going through challenges, emotional challenges, and also physical challenges, and and whenever this happens, they just sort of lament that this is an aspect of consciousness, and in these future uploaded minds where they have full control over the sort of network configuration of their brains, they've taken most of the sort of just the really simplistic ways in which we feel pain, just sort of your body suffers pain when it suffers certain injuries and things. Now that they have complete and total control over the design of their brain, they just said, well, we're not going to do that anymore. Why would we want to suffer like that for a million years? So they don't feel the break of a bone. Of course, their bones are all artificial. Everything's they basically have robotic bodies, although they're sort of microscopically robotic and indistinguishable from biology. But whatever sort of damage that the body suffers does not have to be experienced in an agonizing fashion. It can just be experienced in an informational fashion. It's like, okay, you're damaged, go fix it. And then you just leave it up to the intellectualism of a sentient mind to deal with the situation.
You mentioned that all mental descendants of a common mental ancestor have an equal primacy in their claim to the ancestral identity. Game theoretically, it could be interesting if different branches sort of, some of them went renegade, for instance, and maybe a renegade branch would want access to the original branches or the owner's branch's property or things. Is this something that you worry about? And whether, if you punish a renegade branch and then reunify, the original would then share the memory of the punisher, the punishment?
One thing I don't get into too much is law and politics. I sort of there's a certain kind of writer and a certain kind of reader that would find that interesting, and first of all, I've never actually been much of a professional at understanding the subtleties of law and politics, so it would actually be hard for me to do a good job of that. But so I don't actually show too many scenes where various descendant branches are bickering over who's going to get the house. Like I don't know. That's a rather trite concern to million-year-old omnipotent omniscient being. Like
I guess material scarcity wouldn't be that much of a problem.
I think in some of these philosophy of mind discussions, people always ask, well, should the various branches have legal responsibility for each other's crimes? Or if one person commits a crime and then produces two branches, or should they both go to prison or whatever? Like, I suppose there's a certain circle where that's fun to debate, but I guess I don't find that particularly fascinating. And even if I was going to write a story about it, this wasn't the right story for that. I couldn't tell all stories all at once in one book. I guess I can write a sequel about the legal ethics of branches committing crimes and then their various legal responsibilities. But that was so off the map of this story that I had to keep the story sort of on track.
What kinds of governance, not government necessarily, but governance structures would you think would be appropriate, in this kind of identity branching world?
Well, I do show a very sort of thin picture of what the government's structure is. I don't really go into it in much detail, but there is this assembly of, sort of, it's basically when sort of the representative leaders of the various planets all sort of converge once in a while to sort of make matters of policy. And I don't really, they sort of act like a parliament essentially, or a senate of some sort. They kind of all come together and they make decisions and they all kind of vote fairly democratically. And they're mostly discussing not matters of ethics and rights, but just like how to allocate physical resources to build space stations and stuff. They're just trying to get like stuff done. They're not really arguing about who has the right to do what. But it is a highly democratic and also extremely sort of I lost the word. Self-determination, respecting sort of concept. If everyone is ancient and extremely wise and knowledgeable, then those kinds of people are not going to be particularly interested in being told what they can and what they can't do. They're too grand. They're too huge for that, right? So there isn't a whole lot of depiction of characters being sort of told what they can't do, as long as they're, not trying to, I don't know, blow up a planet or something. I don't know. So it doesn't come up too much in the depictions of the assembly. What they're debating is whether or not. So, the Demos character I mentioned has this grave concern about destroying absolutely everything. And he actually does want this assembly to essentially restrict the options and actions of Lysandra. He wants them to constrain her ability and her right to pursue a solution to the USIP. And for the most part, this political assembly is, very conservative about doing that. Their general policy is, you don't go around telling people they can't do what they want to do. His whole point is he's trying to say, well, yeah, but this is different because she's going to destroy the universe, and that's he's winning some adherents, and he's also sort of not winning all the arguments, and it's sort of unclear how he's going to sway that decision. But it's very clear that such a decision would be a huge decision. The decision to restrict Lysandra in that fashion would be considered a humongous deal. So that's sort of how I depict that.
Early in the discussion, we spoke about dystopias and the reason why you didn't want to write a dystopia this time. But if you were to write a dystopia on the far future world of branching and hiving and all that sort of stuff, what would it be like?
Well, it would be sort of the opposite of normal dystopias. So people like to write and read, or people like to script and watch stories in which artificial intelligence and robots are the evil enemy, and that's the dystopia. So if I were to depict sort of a negative view of society, it would be to show that the Luddite perspective is the dystopian sort of evil. The people holding back scientific and technological progress are the ones that are causing the harm. That and in sort of in lines of a dystopian, they're the ones who are sort of through their actions creating a broken world. So if I wanted to show a dystopia, that's where the damage would be coming from.
Would you portray the good guys as accelerationists? To what degree of unbridledness in acceleration would count? Would there be risk averse?
Transhumanism, which is not a term that I have ever used to describe myself because I just kind of don't like the sound of it. There are people within, I guess, transhumanism or futurism who are, really think we need to sort of deliberately put the foot on the accelerator or something. I just think we need to just let science and engineering keep plucking along. It's been going great for the last 50,000 years. It seems to have certain exponential qualities to it, depending on how you plot things and what you choose to put on the plot. And
50,000 years? Are you talking about just like general human progress?
Go back to fire, go back to wheels. I mean, how long have we been sort of being ingenuitive? Sure, things didn't really ramp up
the hand axe
years ago, or things really ramped up 5,000 years ago, then things really ramped up 200 years ago. Like, you can pick your knee of the curve, right? When people talk about the knee of an acceleration curve, that actually has no mathematical truth to it. There is no knee of an exponential curve. It's not true. People think that there's some sort of singular turning point in an exponential curve, but actually just depends on how you zoom in on the curve. At any rate, no, I just think that we need a society that broadly values science and broadly values sort of technological innovation on the results of scientific discoveries. If we just keep that alive, that's good enough for me. We just need a society that values science and or consequently values using scientific insights to build new things. And we'll get there. I know it's not a particularly dramatic prescription, but I actually think it'll work.
You're not worried about existential catastrophe or nuclear?
I am. So in 2015, actually this comes back to the story in a completely different way. It's sort of interesting that we got to this. So in 2015, I wrote an article called let me see, I think I get mind uploading and the meaning of life in the universe and everything. Oh my God, what is the title of it? Anyway, it's of course the title is a tongue-in-cheek play on a Douglas Adams quote. So,
that's right.
I do think that the fact that we are a single planet species is absolutely unforgivable. Because I think we're like the only sentient species in the galaxy. I think it's like a huge deal if humanity dies out. And, people say, well, everybody thinks it's a huge deal, but I think it's a huge deal for more than just selfish reasons. Most people don't want humanity to die out because, humans are great or human culture is great. But I think humans represent something even bigger than that. I think we're one of the, very rare cases of the evolutionary emergence of sentience. And therefore, if we get obliterated by an asteroid or take a pick, climate change, it's not like there are species spread all over the galaxy that'll just sort of carry the torch for us. So, well, humanity blew it, but, the aliens, in the next star system over, like, they'll do it. I don't think they're there to do it. So I am really concerned about, human existential risk, which is why I think we need to become multiplanetary, and ultimately we need to become multi-stellar system. We need to become as distributed within the galaxy as possible so as to survive any local calamities. Local calamities could be external, meaning asteroids and supernovas and uh, gamma ray bursts, and take your pick. But it could also be internal. It could just be some sort of stupid religious stultification that just sort of drives culture into the ground, or we might just through some sort of climate change kind of I don't think climate change will actually make humans extinct. Some people think it will. I don't, but I think it could put us in a position where we can't make much progress anymore. Just sort of basically make innovation almost impossible. One of the biggest problems with the way we use our resources is we have been sort of gifted this pool of coal and oil that we can use to bootstrap civilization, but we're only going to get one shot at that. If we don't get it, if we don't use that to bootstrap other things, nuclear and all of the conventional renewables, I think primarily solar, everything else is sort of an indirect version of solar, except I guess tidal energy is sort of gravitational. But if we don't get our culture sort of shifted over to that on the back of oil and coal, there's no second chance because the oil and coal will be gone, right? So that's another sort of local catastrophe. And that's why, again, we need to sort of spread out. We need to get to as many planets and as many planets around other stars as possible. One might ask, why do we need to be around other stars? Well, it comes back to like the religious thing. Like, what if we come up with basically self-destructive memes, basically ideas that basically convince ourselves to inadvertently destroy ourselves, to just, we're all going to become religious fundamentalists. And it would be a really good idea if that idea can't infect, every society, because some of those societies are literally in another star. I'm not sure if being on Mars is far enough away, sort of in the sort of transmission of memes and ideas between an Earth society and a Mars society. Could the emergence of some spectacularly self-destructive religion infect the other society? You just sort of proselytize over to the other society and convert everybody in both the Earth and the Mars society still willingly kind of like kill themselves. So we really need to spread out. So yeah, to your point, I'm very worried about existential risk. What I don't worry about too much is the stupid Terminators like shooting everybody to death. I'm so tired of that story. It's so dumb, it's boring, and it gives Luddites like some sense of validation, which I think is wrong. And I'm so annoyed at it. So, yeah. And if people like those stories, you know what? You don't need my story. There are a billion stories out there that will let you revel in your fear of technology. If you want that story, don't worry. Somebody else has got that covered for you. It's just not me.
Well, I hear that James Cameron is going to create a new Terminator series, maybe with more of a philosophical nuance to it than, humanoid chromium skeletons walking around with like glowing red eyes with big guns and like the natural want to kill people. I guess one of the philosophies that worries me is ethylism. Sorry?
I think he's going to keep making Terminator movies forever, but
yeah. Well, let's hope that they're more nuanced in the future. But ethylism is the one that I wanted to bring up, and that is the idea that suffering is the only morally relevant qualia. All other experience, the reduction of suffering has overriding importance to everything else to the degree where it becomes permissible to wipe out all sentience, through some sort of doomsday machine. People are really thinking about this. Extreme hardline ethylism. I think you could
let's just make sure that we're being clear on our point. So, motivation, because some viewers might not have followed that thread. The motivation to wipe everything out is because it suffers. So to erase suffering, just get rid of everything.
Yeah. Right. Vacuum phase collapse, or just some more subtle means of reducing suffering by just antinatalism. It sort of
begs the question of. This comes up in arguments about euthanasia and whatever, is non-existence or death actually preferable to existence, if the existence is coupled by suffering. So, I suspect we're venturing into a territory that many, many, many people have debated at length, far more than I've considered. So I don't think I'm really qualified. But it does feel to me like there's something extremely empty about saying that the solution to the existence of a bad thing is to just get rid of everything so that the bad thing isn't there. Because then you got rid of all the, like, I don't know, there's something very, very empty about that argument that I can't quite elucidate right now, but it seems fundamentally flawed in a way that I'm not quite seeing right now, but that's just crazy.
Well, another question is, now that you've finished this book, have you started to think about what another book, another novel might look like? Is there any follow-up ideas to this one, or is there another story that you've got sort of burning in the back of your mind you want to tell?
Short answer, no. I don't tend to write books very often. The book was the 2014 book. It's been 10 years since I wrote a book. I spent the better part of the past year writing this book. It has been my consuming hobby, and I have a lot of hobbies, so I'm not sure if it'll be my immediate next hobby. Maybe I'll do something else. Do I have any ideas for stories that are just sort of burning to be told or yearning to be told? I would not necessarily say that like I came off this book with a clear notion that there's like a story that needs to be told as a result of having written this story, some sort of begging sequel or prequel. It's a standalone book that doesn't necessitate, another book. There are a lot of things that would be fun to explore. So in the spirit of like Ian Banks' Culture series, not all of his books are sequels to each other, but I think a number of them sort of exist in this shared universe that he called the Culture. So, this is a story that I told in this world that we've sort of been describing throughout the interview, where sort of, humanity operates this way. I think this story is kind of tied up with a bow at the end, and there's not much to do with it. But maybe there are other stories about the million-year future of mind-uploaded humans who are curious about consciousness that I could tell. I could show stories about branching identity in far greater detail than I go into. Sort of a lot of the things that I specifically said I pushed to the side, I could make those the subject of some other story. So yeah, but I haven't started writing another book.
We discussed at the start of the interview your motivation for writing this book, but I just thought your motivation for writing a book, but then there's the other question of what it actually felt like to write a novel like this. I mean, it's all about qualia and exploring qualia and, trying to find different ways of feeling. So is there anything that you felt that you never felt before in the process of writing this book, or did you find it was like, particularly rewarding? Did you think new thoughts? Did you experience new experiences? What was it like for you to write a book like this that was actually exploring the search for new qualia?
That's an interesting question. Sort of over the course of the writing, I had some ideas, which then sort of, in most cases made their ways into various scenes. And some of them are, what Stephen King would call darlings, these sort of ideas that then got written up that, I just kind of like them. It's sort of what I consider to be eloquent pieces of writing. Of course, Stephen King's famous point about darlings is that you need to kill most of them in order to actually improve your writing. So be it. But, yeah, so some of the scenes are just, I just like them. There are scenes in the book that are just fun to read. I think, I don't know, maybe other people won't like them, but there's some scenes that I just think sort of flow in a very entertaining fashion, and that felt good.
Did it feel good writing them?
Yeah, no,
What was the experience of coming up with these scenes? Was it like you're staring at a blank page and sweating and wondering, how should I start? Or was it more of a flow? Was it?
I often get into a flow state. The hemming and hawing I do lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how I'm going to solve some corner that I got myself into. So that's less fun, although it is sort of fun to kind of think through a challenge, like how am I going to get the story back on track? But the actual act of writing, I've always enjoyed, which is why I write so much. I, I think this is something they say about introverts is that we sort of think through writing. We think through long form writing, and I find that my ideas coalesce better when I'm trying to organize them on the page. I do a lot of very long form thinking and daydreaming, but it's not until I try to write it down that it feels like I've really sort of gelled it. So yeah, I mean, it's catharsis is the wrong word, but I like writing. um, I hope people think I'm good at it. I don't know, maybe I like writing, but it doesn't amount to it. I don't know, but I love it, so probably not gonna stop.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope you do continue because that was a really fascinating novel, to be honest. It was great. So, final thoughts. So, let's just open up a space for you to add whatever you think hasn't been raised, or any final thoughts, or tying a bow in this interview, so to speak.
Yeah, what other points do I want to make about the book? I'm conveying some ideas that I would like to present. So I would actually like people to read the book. I think that some people will be entertained by the story. I think some people will be entertained by the sort of display of some philosophical concepts and some sort of exploration of aspects of sort of consciousness and thought experiments about it. Um, and of course, for the last 10 years at least, I've been essentially writing defenses of branching identity, and I would like, sort of an understanding of that to come out of reading it. Not necessarily if people don't agree with it, they don't have to feel converted, but I want them to understand why the branching model feels sensible to some people, such as myself. Um, and then the other final thing I would like readers to get might actually be lost because it only culminates in one scene and then it gets dropped on the floor for the rest of the book. There is there are sort of multiple climaxes because there are sort of multiple aspects of the story that come together. And they each have their own sort of final culminating scene. But there is one scene where that 2015 paper, Mind Uploading and the Meaning of Life, the Universe, and Everything. Like I said earlier, one of the points of that paper was sort of my expectation that there isn't other intelligent life, and therefore the sort of criticality of humans spreading out. But the other main point of that paper is this what I believe is the value and purpose of, and then fill in the blank, the value and purpose of life, meaning like a single person's life, or what is the value and purpose of civilization? What is the point of a species, a sentient species, sort of producing culture? And then at a larger scale, what is the purpose of the entire universe? What is the universe here for? And then you can go another level. You go, what is the purpose of existence? So you can kind of take this at various abstractions or various levels. And I do actually have a theory of the explanation for that, which is laid out in that 2015 paper, 2015 article. And there is a scene in the story that presents that. It explains my theory of purpose, which is the purpose of anything, people, a planet, a galaxy. The purpose is to perpetuate conscious experience. It's the experience, the experience of being conscious and the experience of experiencing. This state of being aware of existence and ongoing events and own internal thoughts and sort of the broad the broad sort of canvas upon which all of life and all of existence is sort of playing out. And the fact that there is something consciously aware of it and experiencing it is the purpose. The purpose is to be experienced, which is why it's so angstful to think of the universe as dying, because with the dying of the universe dies the last conscious being, and the moment that the last conscious being dies, the entire purpose of existence is gone. And that is, the most inconceivable travesty that one can imagine. And this all comes to a head in the story, and it is also the point of my 2015 book. And I would definitely like readers to take that away, because it is my most fundamental sort of philosophical sort of pillar. It's huge, it's not, how to have a singularly happy life as me today, in the world. It's not even, what is in the interests of the nation or what is in the interests of the world. I have this, to say I'm concerned about it comes across as a little but I think that it's worth giving some thought to why we think any of this matters. And my answer is consciousness. That's my answer.
Fascinating. It was really an enjoyment to read. I mean, so much interesting philosophical exploration based on what's known about how the universe works. It's not really a fantasy, although it might come across as a fantasy because it's far future. A lot more is possible, but yeah, it is really worth a read, and I encourage everybody listening here to get a copy and give it a read and share with Keith your feedback and rate it, review it. So yeah, I really appreciate you writing this book and also for spending the time for doing the interview.
Thank you. Well,
it's been great.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.